Go ahead and jump in. To kick things off, appreciate you all joining as always. Love how much engagement we get from these and the feedback we get ongoing. As always, this will be recorded. So if there's something you want to revisit later, if there's coworkers you couldn't make it, you want to send it to, you'll see an email this afternoon from Rivial that will have the recording and any materials included with that. And feel free to respond to that. Reach out to me if you don't see that email come through or have any issues getting that recording. One ask I always have during these is ask lots of questions to myself, to others in the group chat here. I really want these to be engaging, informative. However, we can do that. If something I'm covering, something around the topic comes up, feel free to shoot it over. Don't feel like you need to wait till the end. And I will try and hit on those as we go through here during the webinar. Today, we're talking maturing third-party risk management and really a focus on the cybersecurity review piece and doing deep dive cybersecurity reviews. And ultimately, my goal with this presentation is to help reduce risk and as well as meet NCUA state examiner, FDIC examiner requirements around vendor due diligence. Because as we'll talk about, third-party risk is becoming a huge issue and growing more and more. And real quick, I'm going to pause. I have having some tech difficulties, Aaron, in the chat here. Is everyone else able to see and hear me, or see the screen and hear me at least? Lindsay, you're okay. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you, guys. So, Aaron, sorry about that. If the issues continue, I will be sure to send the recording and slides over to you at the end here. I know Zoom can be pesky. We've all fought with that. Awesome. So as I'm diving in here, one disclaimer with this presentation that I do want to make is this isn't the easy route. Doing due diligence and vendor diligence properly isn't easy, but it's the right way to do it. And so my hope is that I can walk through the full process, the full life cycle of how to do the deep dive vendor reviews, and then provide tips, tricks, resources along the way to hopefully help streamline parts of it. But that is one caveat I always like to start with is that it's very difficult to, it's a lot of work. It is. There's no getting around doing deep dive vendor reviews. And real quick, I want to do a quick poll of the audience. And I want to understand how many folks oversee all of vendor management and how many are just the security leader focused on the security side of vendor management. So if you wouldn't mind quickly in the chat just saying all vendor management or security leader, would love to just kind of see who we're working with today. And the presentation will focus on the whole life cycle. I'll focus a lot more on the security side, but it'll cover the whole bit. Awesome. So about half and half. Some security leaders, a lot of folks oversee all of it. Cool. So a great mix. Appreciate it. All right. Well, let's go ahead and dive in here. So quick agenda. I'll go over some introductions, objectives here that we're going to cover today. I'm going to briefly talk through why vendor security matters and some recent breaches as well, just to kind of level set so we're all on the same page on the importance of this, what's taking place out there in the wild today, just to kind of so we're all on the same page for why it matters, why it's important, why examiners are focusing on this so heavily. From there, I'm going to spend the majority of the presentation on this third bullet here and the key steps to performing the reviews and walk through that whole vendor security life cycle. And so that will take a good majority of the presentation. Then I'll touch on CUECs and fourth party tracking, another important part of the vendor management process that examiners have been asking about a lot lately. Then we'll talk through some incident response and then I'll provide some resources, takeaways, and we'll wrap up with a Q&A. But again, feel free to jump in with questions as we're going through. So who am I? Lucas Hathaway. I've been with Rivial over almost 12 years now. So I've been working with financial institutions and helping mature their security programs over the last 10 years. So I have a lot of experience working with examiners, working with vendor management teams, especially on the security side. I usually meet with the client's NCUA examiner about once a month. And so I kind of get fresh intel all the time as far as what they're focusing on, what they're seeing, what reports they're getting. I also host a community and an annual NCUA panel where we interview NCUA examiners as well as get to ask them for direct feedback. What are they focusing on this year? What are their top findings? What are they seeing across other organizations? And I see we have a bank examiner on the webinar today as well, which is really exciting because I'd love to kind of do some of the same with the FDIC state and bank side of things to get their feedback on what they're seeing, what they're focusing on. So Kimberly, I'd love to connect after the webinar. So worked with tons of financial institutions, and I threw this last piece on here as well. I've performed over 1,000 vendor security reviews, and that isn't hyperbole. That's not an exaggeration. When I first started as an information security analyst here at Rivial and was doing consulting, we worked with a partner that did a ton of vendor security, vendor management 4 different banks and credit unions. And so I would be reviewing about 500 vendors per year and their security and the whole gamut as far as reading SOC reports, top down, searching for hundreds of controls in each of those SOC reports, et cetera. And I joke that I live to tell the tale. So I'm speaking from experience and knowing how much work this is. And hopefully I can kind of help streamline some of that process as we discuss the right way to do things and then hopefully how to make that easier. So kicking off with why it matters now. I think most folks in this group, I see we got a lot of security leaders and a lot of folks who oversee all of vendor management are pretty aware of some of the why. But I like to start with this at least briefly that there are more third party and SaaS applications than ever. Every lot of things are moving to the cloud. We have a lot of bank and credit union clients who are moving a lot of their internal data centers to AWS, Google, Azure, to different cloud providers as well. And so there are more and more applications every year. It used to be we do a risk assessment with folks and be like, oh, we have 20 critical SaaS applications we use. Now it's 200, 300, 400, depending on the size organization that we need to look at. And so you guys, I'm sure, know this better than anyone how fast that is growing. The other piece is AI tools, which increase data sharing and unknowns. With AI, there's additional data centers involved, additional data sharing. It adds a whole nother layer that we need to make sure we're including in our vendor management process and taking into consideration when we're doing those deep dive security reviews. And then the final piece is because of all this, regulators are expecting stronger third party risk management programs. And of course, there's two parts. Got to have good security. You also need to meet regulations at financial institutions. And so that's really why it's so important. It's why regulators are focusing on this. And I actually included a stat from the NCUA here that 73% of reported breaches at credit unions, or incidents, I should say, involve third parties. And I thought that was fascinating at how high that number was. I mean, it's again, not a surprise with how many there are out there and how much we're relying on third parties, but that really hit home for me of, wow, this is a huge risk. The likelihood of this risk being realized is really high. We need to make sure we're properly assessing our vendor security and have a good process in place to do that ongoing. I also want to touch on a few examples of recent breaches affecting banks and credit unions here. One is, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with these, hopefully you weren't affected, but again, that likelihood is fairly high that at least a couple folks on this call were. But one being the MoveIt supply chain breach, which exposed data of over 500,000 members, ongoing operations in Trellis ransomware attack, as well as CUSO financial services. And so, again, wanted to share a few recent, semi-recent, real examples of where vendor risk, it really was realized. And again, just why it's important, why we need to continue improving these programs and our processes around them. All right. I promised I wouldn't spend too long on the why and really get into the meat of what we're focusing on today. And getting into the key steps to performing these reviews. Now, you'll notice in quotes here, I put risk assessments because when done properly, vendor security reviews and that whole life cycle from onboarding to decision making and ongoing and tracking should really align with the 8 key elements of a proper cyber and information security risk assessment. Now, I do always want to be careful with terminology here because risk assessment gets used for everything. I see vendor questionnaires that are 15 questions that go out. That's called a risk assessment. Certainly part of the whole vendor risk process, but not a risk assessment by itself. And so that's why I put it in quotes that, again, when done properly, this whole life cycle really is a risk assessment. It includes and aligns with all the 8 key elements. And so we're going to go into deep detail on all of these items, but the first step is onboarding. Really your system, your application, whatever that third party is or providing, or could just be a service even. Then we're going to talk through classification of that vendor, which is really determining the impact. How important is that vendor? What kind of data are they going to get? What's the impact if that vendor's breached or go down? Then we're going to look at questionnaires, which I see a lot of these, what they're good for, what they're bad for, to help us determine the risk of the vendor. Then we're going to talk through in detail how to do proper control reviews for each of these vendors to reduce that risk. So we're left with a residual risk of this vendor. And finally, we're going to talk through the decision and follow-up process, which is really the risk treatment. You've assessed all this risk, you're left with some risk left over. Are we going to onboard this vendor? Are we going to accept the risk of this vendor? Do we need to follow up with them, get more information? What does that process look like internally? And then we're going to dive into CUECs, with the complementary user entity controls, and how we track those, how to test those ongoing. We're going to talk through fourth parties, so your vendors, and how to track those, the importance of those, kind of best practices there. And then finally, we'll tie it all together with ongoing oversight and testing. And so this is really in kind of a single visual what that whole process and life cycle looks like when vendor risk management is done properly here. So I'm going to dive in and start with onboarding. Now, the biggest problem I see here, and I'm sure lots on the call can relate with this, um, is not knowing about new vendors. That some business owner, someone in the organization goes out, signs up, could be a new web application, a new website that they're starting to use, whatever it may be. But that is the biggest problem that I see with this. And there's kind of an old, saying in security that you can't protect what you don't know you have. And so it's so critical to ensure that there's a process in place to identify and be notified of any new vendors that the organization is starting to use so you can properly onboard them and take them through this process. Just to kind of hammer this home, the CIS controls, if any of you are familiar, that there's 18 main categories for the CIS controls. Number one is asset inventory. And that really goes back to the reason being they're risk weighted. So the highest risk, the most important ones are first. And it's because you have to know what you have. You have to have a proper way to track those vendors and be notified of those vendors so you can properly assess their risk, review their security, and make sure that your customer and member data is secure. Common problems we see are security's looped in at the last minute. So maybe you're onboarding a new vendor and you're not you, but someone on the team, a business owner, a operations person, whoever it may be, has been meeting with vendors and assessing them, who they want to bring on and is best fit for their solution. And security is oftentimes looped in last. Like, okay, we've picked our vendor of choice. Let's do the security review. We're ready to get started. And unfortunately, we want security, and I recommend that the security team be involved as early as possible. And so one solution to this is updating the policy. I know it's just an admin control, kind of starting to socialize that brings security in the early evaluation phases. Ideally, when they've narrowed it down to maybe their top 3 vendors they're thinking of using or top 3 solutions. And then that security review can even be part of the decision making process. So where security's not brought in last minute and just, at that point, usually someone's pretty sold on the vendor they want to go with, regardless of security. But starting to socialize and make it part of the culture that security is part of that vendor selection process. Once they've narrowed it down to 3, gotten quotes, they know these are kind of their 3 favorites. Starting to use security as a criteria for the vendor choice as well. The next, of course, is shadow IT and AI. We see that a lot where, again, things are being signed up for, brought in, and not going through the proper channels. And so, again, I would add hooks in that procurement process as much as possible to bring security in early. And then even putting in a process periodically to check with the accounting department or whoever it is that pays the bills and would have that record of all outgoing payments and just validating that along with your vendor list to reconcile it, to make sure, okay, did anyone bring in new tools that didn't go through the proper channels or through the proper process that we didn't know about? So that helps kind of catch some of those after the fact. And so I think most folks are are used to this. One other recommendation I would have is including this in your annual or quarterly user training. So, just starting to bring up to users that, hey, when you are starting to evaluate vendors, loop in security as part of that process. And really starting to work with those different business owners, because the goal of security is to enable those business owners securely. And so, that's really would be my recommendation as far as trying to socialize that, include it in training, include it in policy, and don't make it hard on folks. You want to make it as smooth as possible. They're excited about getting a new tool to make their job easier. Let's assist them, let's enable them, but make sure they're doing it in a secure manner with our onboarding process. So at least now we know about the tool. And now we need to classify it. And I have seen some crazy matrices that are used for classifying vendors. And sometimes I even see classification and risk assessment kind of get used interchangeably. But the goal with the classification is to determine how critical this vendor is to the organization. So I see a lot of different, categories such as critical, significant, insignificant. I put tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 on here just to keep it fairly generic. It doesn't necessarily matter what you call those. It more matters how you arrive and classify them, and then what the vendor review process looks like based on that classification. So I see these get really complicated, and my recommendation would be keep it very, very simple. Utilize the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability, and look at those items to determine how you tier them. And so you can certainly tweak this a bit, but my recommendation would be fairly straightforward: is if it has member or customer data or it's critical to operations, it should be a tier 1. So example, lending, a lending tool or online banking. They're going to have member and customer data, immediate tier 1. No additional questions needed. Then you might get to something that's a little squishier, like an email, or the phone system comes up a lot. Now, everywhere's different, but probably doesn't have member data or shouldn't. It might, but it might be considered critical to operations. And so those are ones I would still classify as tier one. If it went down for a full day and it would be a major impact to the organization, that needs to be a tier one. If it has member or customer data stored or transmitted in it, it needs to be a tier one. Just my opinion. You can certainly adjust these categories, but that keeps it pretty simple. I always say if you ask yourself, if, hey, this system were breached or it went down, what would the impact be to the bank or credit union? And the answer is high. It should probably be classified as a tier one or critical vendor. Tier two, this is where, maybe a little more of a gray area. My recommendation would be if it has confidential internal data, but not member or customer data, but maybe like general ledger, payroll, your security documents, strategy plans, board materials, those types of things, those would probably fall into more of a tier two. Or again, if it could be down for a few days, if it could be down for a few days, it's not the end of the world. Those would be kind of our tier twos and how I'd recommend classifying those. Finally, tier three, I would reserve this for no sensitive data. So if confidentiality of the data in a tier three vendor was breached, you don't care. It does not impact the organization. I mean, it doesn't look great that one of your vendors was breached, but it doesn't actually impact your customers, your members, any of that. And it should be able to be down for at least a week, where it can go down for a week. It doesn't affect operations, doesn't affect the organization. It's not a big deal. Again, I know it's pretty high level, but I see this get really, a lot of math and confusing spreadsheets oftentimes used for this. I would keep it really simple. And I also see people cheat and they're putting things with member or customer information in tier two or tier three for certain reasons. And I don't think that's the right approach because if you're putting member data or customer data in another tool, you're taking that responsibility and you need to assess that security program as if it were your own. So, anyways, that's why I recommend this approach. You can certainly tweak these a little bit, but would recommend, again, keeping it pretty simple here. So, we've got our vendors. They're classified as tier one, two, or three, how significant they are based on that impact to the organization. The next piece is determining risk. And that is really where questionnaires are the most useful. So you'll see in a big red down here, I say, do not use for controls. And I see this done all the time where folks will send out 100 question questionnaires asking about all their security controls. Do you have MFA? What kind of passwords do you have? Are the data encrypted in transit at rest? And it's really not the best fit for questionnaires. And a couple reasons I'll explain is one, it's oftentimes sales folks filling out those questionnaires that you're purchasing the tool from, and they're excited to have you as a client. They're excited to get that deal done, and so they're quickly going through. Oh yeah, we have good security. Yep, checking all the boxes, right? Saying yes. And so that's the first reason. Or two, even if a security person is filling it out, ideally, they might, yeah, we have it in place, but you don't have any proof, which is a little bit nerve wracking. I mean, there's some cases you just have to take someone's word for it. But for tier one vendors, those ones storing especially your member customer information, I would not rely on questionnaires or controls if you can avoid it. Now, questionnaires are great for certain things. General information about the system, determining details of the system, like where it's hosted. Do they host it in AWS? Is it hosted in Google Cloud? Is it their own data center? What type does it utilize AI? Is there AI as part of the platform? Informing what different risks might face this system so you're better prepared when you're doing your control review to further mitigate this risk. And so that's where questionnaires really come into play. How many users are using it? Things like that, those more general questions to help you figure out what makes up the system, the types of servers, types of databases used, that would trigger maybe additional controls that you really want to make sure are in place. So that's where I would recommend using questionnaires. I would try and avoid, if at all possible, using them for the controls as you're going through this. All right. So moving to the actual control review. So we got our vendor. We've classified it. We know about it. We've determined the risks with questionnaires. We know that, yeah, it leverages AI. They use SQL databases. It's stored in AWS. So we have some really good background on what makes up the system and what controls we want to be looking for as we're doing these deep dive reviews. And so I want to start with, again, kind of a what not to do, and then get into kind of the proper way to do this, because I see a whole variety of different things done at this stage. And a lot of times I think it's overcomplicated. But some common mistakes, I mentioned relying on questionnaires. Sales fills those out. I oversee a sales team. I know how excited they are to sometimes fill those out, and I make sure we slow down and do it properly. But don't use questionnaires for controls. The other issue I see is skimming SOC reports or exceptions. And what I mean by this is, SOC reports are long and boring documents. I will admit, be the first to admit it. But what I'll often see is, folks look at the SOC report, just kind of skim the no exceptions column, look at the bottom, manage for the management response section, and go, yeah, there's no exceptions noted. They've got good security. We're good to go. And so the issue with that is that SOC auditors are generally just testing what the organizations say they do for a control. So the SOC criteria that says, you need application access. And the vendor might say, we use 4-character passwords. The SOC auditor comes in, tests that, and validates, yep, they do have 4-character passwords, no exceptions noted. Now, we all know that's not good security, but those are some of the things that could be missed. And it's a pretty drastic example. I'd hope a SOC auditor would call that out. But oftentimes controls are admitted, or it's maybe what you wouldn't consider a strong control, but it's what the vendor said they did. The SOC auditor tested it. And so there's no exceptions noted. And so that's one of the issues I see often when folks are just kind of skimming those SOC reports. They don't really know what controls they have in place. They just know there were no exceptions. So at least they're doing what they say they're doing. So it's better than nothing. But again, it doesn't give you a clear picture of their security. The final piece would be accepting self attestations without evidence. Again, it is better than nothing, but would highly recommend reviewing independent audits, independent tests, attestations of compliance done by a third party rather than just, either a questionnaire or a spreadsheet that they've said, yep, we do this, it's in place. And I was speaking to a prospect recently, and I really liked something he said, is I was talking about this process, and he was saying, I was saying trust but verify. And he said, we don't trust. At his bank, we don't trust, we just verify. And so they only count controls in place if they were independently audited. It has to be a third party has proved and validated that control. Excuse me. Just some examples to walk through of kind of common mistakes that we see. And then I want to talk through kind of best practices, how to improve those, and what these would ideally look like. The first thing I often see is for the control review, people don't have a standard framework that they're assessing every vendor against. And I often see this when it's kind of how we just looked over the SOC report, it looks good, that approach. Or oftentimes I'll see, again, a 15, 20 question questionnaire or controls where, again, it's not at all aligned with the organization's framework. And so what I mean by this is if internally that you're aligning with the CIS controls or the NIST controls or the ASET or CAT, any of those different frameworks, CRI, the profile. If internally you get audited against, you're risk assessing yourself against a specific framework, make sure that you're aligning your vendor reviews with that same framework. Because ultimately, these vendors that have this data are really an extension of your program, and you want to make sure it meets the exact same standards you're assessing yourself against. So I would start and say, okay, internally we align with, I'll use NIST as an example today. We align with NIST CSF 2.0, those 100 NIST controls, that's what we assess ourselves against. That's what we track, and that's what we're looking at for our own program. I would highly recommend using those exact same controls to assess your vendors, or at a minimum, a subset. So maybe all 105 or however many it is, you look at internally. Maybe you're just going to look at 50 of those statements, kind of the key ones from each category for your vendors. I would recommend one of those approaches, but ensure that it aligns with those must-have controls from your internal framework. My second recommendation would be requiring proof. And I know I've hit on this a couple of times, but really those SOC reports, audit reports, any independent testing of your vendor is going to be much stronger than, just them saying they do it, a checklist, a questionnaire. And so really reviewing that evidence, reviewing what they provide to validate they are meeting and aligning and meeting your control requirements, the same ones you're looking at internally if you're going to be sharing that member and customer data. Then third, to help streamline this, I'd recommend building a standard document request list for the type of evidence you want to gather from these folks. And so these can be, SOC reports are great, policies. Again, not quite as strong as something independently audited, but at least get a feel for the policies, what they're trying to align with. Attestations and independent audits. So maybe third party, PCI compliance reports are a great one. If they're PCI compliant, maybe they're ISO compliant. Those are some common ones we see. So gathering those. And ultimately, the more the merrier. And I know it drastically depends on the type of vendor it is. The Microsofts, the big organizations, they're going to send you their trust center, and that's all you get. Great. You can download those SOC reports, download what they provide. Smaller vendors, they might just have a spreadsheet they've filled out, a SIG-Lite or something similar. But ultimately, the more the merrier that you can call out and request from that vendor to review to really prove and give yourself and your organization confidence that they have these controls in place. So now we can actually perform the assessment. And so I recommended not skimming SOC reports. So what do I recommend doing? And it's kind of like a treasure hunt, is like I like to compare it to. You have your 100 NIST controls, sticking with this example. It can be any controls, but you got your 100 NIST controls, and you want to go through their documentation and ideally a third party report and validate that that control is in place and audited. And what I mean by that is in place, meaning they say they did it, maybe in the general information, but actually audited, meaning a third party tested it. And I'd recommend capturing both. You don't have to, totally up to you, but just because it's kind of a strength, it adds an additional strength and confidence level to the organization. So if someone says, yep, we do MFA, it's better than not. If a third party also tested that and you have that tracked, that was audited, it should continue to be audited. It just gives you and the organization more confidence that that MFA is really in place and will be operating effectively ongoing. And so as you're going through this, searching SOC report, and again, Control F and finding and searching keywords is going to be your best friend as you're reviewing those, so you don't read them cover to cover. Documenting if they're in place or not, but then also noting any gaps or exceptions, as well as compensating controls. So maybe you require 15 character passwords, but they have 10, but they also have MFA. Just something to note and document as far as, that, hey, they don't quite meet our 15 character password requirement, but at least they have MFA on top of it. We're comfortable accepting that risk and that control gap. So that's how I'd recommend going through those reports and really assessing each individual controls. And I pulled an example here using NIST as well, just to kind of show what this looks like. And so one of the NIST controls is access permissions. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically that access is based on least privilege and includes separation of duties, that this is defined and enforced and reviewed ongoing. And so I pulled a screenshot from a SOC report here as well, where I just Control F user access. It's a user access control. I want to look for these items and was able to find in this SOC report where, okay, user access is based on role privileges. They're defined within the access control system and could see what the auditor saw, what they tested, that they sampled some user accounts, and that there were no exceptions noted. And so this is just a great example of, a quick way for one control, how to go through, use again, Control F and find in the document everything around user access and pull out those specific items to go through the different controls and check them off as in place or audited and make sure you're properly tracking and assessing that. I'll pause here. Any questions so far on this piece as far as doing these reviews, doing kind of the deep dive, going control by control through the security documentation and tracking that, doing kind of a mini audit along with your framework? Any controls or any questions, around that? All right, awesome. Seeing none, I'll continue on here. So the next piece is your risk treatment process. So just kind of recap, we've gone through, we identified the vendor, we were notified of it. We classified it based on the impact, the types of data and availability. We sent out questionnaires, determined do they have AI, what kind of systems they're using, databases, servers, the technical backend, just so we know what controls to look at. We've gathered their SOC reports, their policies, all their security documentation, and we've gone through, assessed those controls one by one and required evidence and stored that evidence with the vendor to validate those controls. And so now we're left with some type of result. And so I'm going to use the example. Let's say it's a critical vendor that's going to have our customer or member information that has pretty good security. They have most of the controls we require internally in place with a few exceptions. This is where the decision comes into place. And so step one, I would recommend pushing back on the vendor if they're missing a critical or what you would consider a key control and it's a critical vendor. And so I'd reach out to them, before you move forward and sign any contract and say, hey, we noticed you didn't have any physical security in place. We noticed you didn't have multi-factor authentication. We're wondering, did we miss something? Did you not provide any evidence of that? Or is it not in place? And, so depending how they answer, oftentimes it's just, oh yeah, here's a screenshot or here's evidence, here's a sample, you missed it, whatever it may be. And it really is in place. If it's not in place, that's where you can actually make the decision that, hey, that is a deal breaker for us for this critical of a vendor. We need to consider an alternative. And that's why it's so great if your security is included and thought of and brought in early in the vendor selection process, because it's not too late. You haven't told everyone else no and had your vendor a choice. There's still other alternatives you're working with. And so that's option one. Option B is if they have a gap and it is a high risk vendor, you can still work with them. You just have to accept that risk. And that's where you want to make sure you document that. And so regardless whether you accept it or not, you want to document that decision. We decided to work with this vendor. Here was their final risk. Here's their security control reviews, assigning it to a risk owner who's responsible for that risk, who accepted it, and follow-up dates to check in and re-review that risk. And so that's really a critical part, especially on the exam front. Regulators, FDIC and NCUA will both want to see this as far as where did you make the risk determination for the vendor? Whether you decide to move forward with them or not? Were there any control gaps that didn't meet your internal requirements? And if so, do you have compensating controls in place? Are you accepting that risk after you've assessed it? And where is that documented and tracked? So that can be in a spreadsheet, it can be anywhere, it can be in software, but just making sure you're tracking those final decisions, why you made them, and storing all the supporting evidence, supporting documentation with that as well. The next piece are the CUECs, the complementary user entity controls. And I'm curious if anyone on the webinar today was asked about these by their examiners, because I feel like I hear it quite a bit when talking to folks at banks and credit unions, that examiners asked about our complementary user entity controls. They're digging into these. What do we need to do with them? And so I'd be curious if you just want to throw in the chat if anyone here had their examiner look at that, dug into that, or asked about them. Absolutely. Need to record them with the bank's response? Yes. Yeah. So this is a big one. Seen a bunch of yeses. That's really been a key area. What these are the controls that you, the organization, is responsible for, that is bringing on the vendor. And so what do we do with these? And so let's say I'm going to use the Rivial platform as an example. You're bringing on the Rivial platform. We're responsible for securing the data, the encryption, everything about the software, maintaining it, patching it, et cetera. We are the vendor. We're responsible for that. If you're bringing on the tool, one thing you're responsible for is granting user access, how you control that user access, the password length, whether or not you use MFA, if you're going to do any backups. Usually that's kind of a shared one. Sometimes organizations are responsible, sometimes the vendor, sometimes both. How you disable and when employees leave and access needs to be changed. How are you tracking that? What does that procedure look like? And so what do you do if the system goes down? If the vendor just disappears, you can't access their software? Do you have workaround steps, a business continuity plan? Those are those complementary user entity controls, really the risk areas and controls that you're responsible for, even if it's a vendor software and you're using their tool. And so what the heck do we need to do with these? First, you got to document them or extract them. And usually these are all documented in the SOC report. There's a section called complementary user entity controls. You need to go through and pull those out and track those. For each one, you need to assign an owner to it. Who's going to be responsible for testing that control when it's tracked? Third step is setting a test frequency. I'd recommend at least once a year. Some quarterly might make more sense. That user access changes for a critical system might need to be quarterly. Then you need to test the controls. And by test, I mean go in and validate it's operating effectively. So if the control is we will have MFA, go in, review settings, review logs, validate yes, MFA is still there, take a screenshot, store that with the control. And that last piece is keep evidence. Storing that evidence that you tested the control with a date of when it was last tested to show that those are testing ongoing. I know a lot of us do this for examiners and because they're requiring it, but it actually is really important for security as well. And these complementary user entity controls should align with your risk assessment and be part of your internal information security, cybersecurity risk assessment. It should be part of the same process, because you'll also hear examiners ask, have you tested the key controls in your risk assessment? Again, something critical to make sure that those risk assessment controls are operating effectively. This is just an extension of that, testing these controls on an application system-specific basis to validate that those are operating effectively ongoing. And that really ties together the whole picture, because you're testing your internal controls related to the vendor, and then you're testing the vendor's controls in their SOC report. And so you have a lot of confidence at that point that all controls on both sides are operating effectively, and you're doing everything you can to reduce that risk of a potential vendor incident. So I pulled an example here, one from our software and one I typed in a quick spreadsheet here of what this could look like. And so I pulled the vendor being Microsoft, and sorry it's a little small here, but the vendor's Microsoft, the solution's Office 365, can have a control ID. You want to document what the control is. Then you want to document what evidence you're going to gather. So maybe it's a procedures and it's a sample from Office 365 showing that there's proper password requirements in place. You set a test frequency and who's responsible for that. And then that's when, again, however you want to gather this, you can use email. Our system, you can set the frequency and email goes out periodically to that person at the defined frequency, reminding them, hey, it's time to test this evidence. You need to validate this control for Office 365. Then they can click a link to that evidence and upload their screenshot a report, whatever the proof is that they tested that control. And then you're doing your due diligence. You're tracking who's testing, when they're testing, and you have proof that they tested that control. So just want to provide kind of a visual of what this can look like in software form and spreadsheet form for how you can track these, having a link to evidence and track the testing ongoing of the C. The next piece is fourth party vendor management. And this is always fun to think through and say, as far as your vendors. And so I put a cheesy diagram here that I grabbed from the company is your organization, your bank, your credit union, et cetera. Then you have your third party vendor who you're onboarding and assessing their risk. And then that vendor has a bunch of different critical vendors that they leverage. And so this web could go on, but I would recommend at least tracking the fourth party piece. It's often ignored. MoveIt breach was an example of this. And so how you can track these, there's a couple different ways. Again, key subprocessors should be listed in those SOC 2 reports. So going through those reports and documenting any critical organizations. Oftentimes this is their cloud provider like an AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, et cetera. But documenting those key fourth parties that they rely on. Also, this is a good use for questionnaires. Again, maybe not quite as reliable, but reaching out and just asking what critical fourth parties do you leverage and keeping that list. Finally, there's tools out there. They're pretty expensive that at least track the major ones. Things like a BitSite, Black Kite, Security Scorecard. We're not affiliated with any of those, but they do a decent job of tracking some of the really major vendors that are fourth parties of these different vendors you're leveraging. But I would recommend still always at a minimum keeping a manual tracking list. Pull it from the SOC report when you're doing your due diligence each year. Include it in a questionnaire if you're asking the vendor, hey, what critical third parties do you rely on? And make sure you have a list tracking those. And really the importance of this piece is that you want to make sure that if you hear about a breach in the news, you know if one of your vendors is using it. So maybe you don't use that vendor exactly, but one of your vendors uses that vendor. You want to be able to quickly sort, filter, and pinpoint which of your vendors might use that vendor, reach out to them proactively, and determine if your information was affected in any way. So that's really the key piece is you're able to be proactive if you're tracking these fourth parties as far as response time, if there ever is an incident. I see a couple questions here, so I'm going to pause and jump to these questions before we continue on. What would you recommend, or how have you seen organizations embed the cybersecurity TPRM process where there's no formal VMO/procurement team? How to ensure you're getting the initial intake questionnaire in the hands of the business before they need to obtain any approvals or sign any contracts? Yeah, and that's one of the most challenging pieces is knowing that vendors being onboarded and making sure that it's being done properly. And really the easiest, if there's no procurement process requirements they have to go through, is through training and trying to kind of make that culture shift. So if you can add it to the security policy, train people on that policy, like, hey, a security requirement we have is to do this. And then I always say, they're gonna say, oh no, it'll slow down the process. But as much as you can partner with the business and the different business owners to say, hey, I want to enable you to get the best tool possible. And ideally have them bring you in early. Say, hey, when you're down to your top 3 vendors, or even if it's just a new website, bring us in, run it by us. That's really the ideal. And even if you can create, I don't know the size of the organization, but a simple form that they could fill out and send you, or an email address where they can just let you know, hey, reviewing this website or going to sign up for this website. And anything to make it really easy on them to notify the team that, hey, we're bringing on this vendor. So then you can kind of jump in and say, hey, we need to get this information. We need to send them questionnaires. And can you please request this documentation so we can review their security controls? And then we have another question here. Do you think there should be a separate classification for fourth parties with no interaction? Example, a third party app hosted on AWS versus fourth parties with interaction. Fourth party vendor that provides an application that we have direct access into, that's a different relationship. All right, I'm going to think through this one a little bit to make sure I understand. Fourth parties with no interaction. Okay, so like AWS, something stored in the cloud with interaction. So we're actually using their application. Yeah, that's a great question. I would say absolutely. So for AWS, I would treat like a standard fourth party. And obviously, so many folks use those that I would just recommend as that fourth party is reviewed annually. That you track AWS as a fourth party, you grab their SOC reports, review them once a year, just to track it as a fourth party and manage that. And then if there's a fourth party with actual interaction, yes, AWS does present a big major concentration risk. I think we saw that late last year when they went down and everybody was affected that day when they were down for a whole day. But to answer the second part of your question here, if there's a fourth party that actually provides an application that you have direct access into, depending how critical that is, I would almost track them as a third party vendor. Maybe your contract isn't with them directly, it's through someone else. But if you're actually interacting with their application, providing data, they're storing, transmitting data, I would classify them almost as just one of your third parties rather than a fourth party and look at it as maybe they're critical, classify them the same way, go through the same process, even if you don't have a contract with them. And if I go back a couple slides, you'll notice I separated vendor versus vendor solution. And the reason being is you often don't just want to do due diligence in the review on the vendor, but actually on the individual solution. So Microsoft, using this, sticking with this example, they provide Office 365. You might use Office 365. You want to track that as a vendor solution that you're doing a full control review process on. You might also use Azure for something completely different. And Microsoft has separate SOC reports, separate security controls for those products. You want to treat those individually. You can track them under one vendor, roll them up the same, but for the purposes of the third party tracking and review process, you want to track those separately since they're different enough, different use cases, different security and controls around those. It's a long answer. Hopefully that helps. So the next piece here, how are we doing on time? About 13 minutes left. Perfect. We talked fourth parties. So kind of the next piece here is ongoing testing and monitoring. So I would definitely recommend annual reviews for any of your tier one and tier two vendors. Again, if tier one is annual, tier two is every other year. You could probably get away with that, and then just review tier three at renewal. Especially if your classification is, hey, they have no confidential data. If they're breached, it doesn't affect any of our data, and they can be down for a period of time. Just at renewal for tier three is perfect, and it can be a lot lighter review. Tier ones, you want to make sure you do the full deep dive review. Tier twos as well, at least every other year, but I would recommend annual for the tier twos as well if you have the resources and bandwidth. The other time is if service changes, I kind of using that example, maybe you work with Microsoft, you're using Office 365, but you start using Azure. That should trigger a re-review, and you'll want to review Azure separately. Or maybe you're using their accounting software and then you get their core system, or vice versa. You're using their core, but they also offer their accounting software and you're starting to use that. You'll want to trigger a re-renewal when how you're using that vendor changes. You're adding modules or even adding a new product that they offer. The other two triggers are if there's a breach. If a vendor ever has an incident, that should trigger a re-renewal. Hopefully that one's fairly obvious. And maybe even a re-review of should we work with that vendor, but making sure you understand what happened, why it happened, what the vendor's doing so it doesn't happen again. And then at renewal as well. Always, whenever you're doing a renewal, you want to reassess on those vendors. And the final piece, reassessment, again, after any major changes. And then finally, the complementary user entity controls. You want to test those periodically, at least once a year at a minimum. Depending on the controls, if they're changing quite a bit, like user access changes frequently, things of that nature, I'd recommend testing quarterly if you have the resources, again, and bandwidth. So we went through how to minimize the chance of a breach, but I did want to cover, since there's still a 73% chance that an incident will involve a third party, what best practices for incident response are for a vendor. And so really there's a couple key things. One, when working with the vendor, ensure that in the contracts, there's a notification criteria and timelines. So you know when that vendor will notify you if there's an incident and how soon they're required to notify you after an incident. So first step's making sure that's included in the contract when you're working with the vendor. Step two, I recommend building a separate vendor breach incident response playbook to really have those steps and not, a big PDF, but hey, a checklist type document, 1-2 pager that walks through each phase of the incident response plan. But if one of your vendors is breached, so if you're notified that a vendor's breached, what is the process? Who does what? Who calls who? Who do you notify? Regulators, insurance, forensics, who do you need to bring in? And what does that process look like? I'd recommend even performing a tabletop with one of your critical vendors. Say, hey, we're doing an IR tabletop, whether that's your core provider, Verifin, online banking, any of those that have a lot of critical data. Say we'd like to, work with you. And even if the vendor doesn't work with you, that's fine. But pretending it's one of those for your tabletop, saying, okay, we found out about a Verifin incident in the news. What do we do? What are our next steps? And kind of walking through that process. And if you can get buy-in from the vendor with what their process would look like for notification to you, even better. But then using that to help improve that playbook. Again, we look at ransomware so often in some of these different incidents. The most likely one is one of your vendors is breached. And so I would really recommend running through that, making sure you have a plan for how and when you notify your customers, how and when you notify the board, insurance, and that all those contacts are up to date. So last here is putting it all together. And this really summarizes kind of the life cycle we walked through. The notification, the onboarding of a new vendor, classifying that vendor based on impact, leveraging questionnaires to get that general information, that risk information, doing deep dive control reviews, not just skimming SOC reports or relying on questionnaires, but reviewing the SOC reports against your controls. Risk treatment, making that risk decision and tracking it, documenting and testing the complementary user entity controls, tracking fourth parties, and then repeating this the ongoing oversight and testing and ongoing monitoring of your vendors. So that really wraps up the core of the presentation. I did want to provide a couple resources if useful. This vendor review template, we have had this and it's been around forever. And it's different control categories. You can document the controls in each category that you assess your vendors against. This has been on the NIST website for years. So again, worth checking out if you need just kind of a quick Word document template to go through with different categories, and you can define your controls within each and mark if they're in place or audited. And then even better is we also offer 2 free AI credits to our AI vendor review software. So if you scan this, or if you're not allowed to scan QR codes because you're good at security, not a trick question, feel free to type in this link here. But you can get access. You don't need to talk to anyone on our team. You can sign up for an account and start using it yourself. And this will allow you to really automate those security control reviews. It allows you to, with 2 AI credits per year. So you can try that out, assess some of your vendors if you have a couple critical vendors you need to assess and see what their security looks like. So again, feel free to screenshot this and check these out if any of these resources are useful. And then we got about 6 minutes left. And so I want to save this time for a quick live demo and any questions. And so I was just going to quickly run through what this AI process looks like. So if you do decide to sign up, you can jump right in, try it out, and leverage it. But also, while I'm doing that, feel free to drop some questions in the chat as well here. All right, so I'm going to jump over to this screen. Hopefully, it looks like that switched my sharing and just walk through quickly how you can automate one of these vendor reviews. And so you can sign up for this for free and get in here, and the controls are already set up and defined. But you can quickly create a vendor review. I'm just going to say we're assessing the Reveal platform, start a new review. And what this does is it duplicates all your controls. So if you've set up the NIST controls in here, we have it set up with the Reveal controls. So it's our different control framework, and there's multiple controls within each of these. So it's about 100 or so different individual security controls. Upload your documentation. I'm going to just drag and drop our SOC 2 report and our information security policy here and click upload. And so again, you can upload, I think by default, it's up to 10 documents. We can adjust that on the back end for you individually. But since we do let people get access, we limit it to 10 documents at a time. So you can upload those documents. It will run through a quick antivirus scan here to make sure that no one's spamming us. And you can see these are clean. So now we go to our controls, and we see our controls are all blank, our application access, our vendor controls, you name it. And you can set these up to be whatever you would like. These could be NIST controls, CIS controls, ASET, CRI profile, you name it. And we can run the AI vendor review. And so I'm going to click run, and it'll say, this is currently running. Usually this takes a minute or two, sometimes 3, depending how much documentation you upload to run this review. And what it does is it removes the manual process of reviewing that SOC report and reading through it. And it lets AI do that and also compares it directly to the controls you care about. You still want to spot check it, but this gives you a really easy way to automate the assessment of your controls, go line by line. And so you can see exactly where you're at, spot check the critical controls, make sure it pulled the right information for those, and really, really speed up your assessments. So that is the goal with this. Again, we'll get to see the results here in about 30 more seconds and set the rating here. But while that's running, any additional questions I can answer around vendor management in general, third-party security reviews, or anything like that? I see one question. Let me jump over here. I lost my chat box. There we go. Do we need additional permission for the vendor before uploading the SOC 2 to the AI-powered review? You shouldn't. Again, since you have a contract with them, they're one of your vendors, you shouldn't need any additional permission from that vendor to do the review. It'd be similar to if you're doing it manually. How do you overcome buy-in, especially from key stakeholders? Yeah, that's always the most challenging. Depending on the stakeholders, whether it's senior leadership or business owners need to do the reviews or both, 2 recommendations would be one, for like the senior leadership type folks, show them the risk of vendor breaches, how often vendor breaches are happening, and again, what examiners are digging into, really leaning on that to try and get buy-in from executive management and those types. If you're talking about business owners bringing on new vendors, that's where again, I spoke a little bit earlier, but really recommend training in the culture shift, saying, "Hey, we're here to enable the organization, help you." Put it in policy, include it in annual training, and just make it as easy as possible. Again, I know some, they think of security oftentimes as slowing the process down and not helping improve things. When our goal is we really want to enable operations to move faster but securely. And so whatever you can do to make that process as simple as possible, um, I think really helps with buy-in from those business owners. So jumping back over here, you can see now this is all populated. So like if I look at unauthorized application access, this is where it has already gone through the documentation, marked in place and audited, and we can very quickly see what's in place and audited across all of our different control areas. So there were a couple here that weren't audited on the vulnerability front. I could follow up on those items or decide to accept those risks. Those give you a very clear picture of what's in place, what's not in place, and it also outlines where it pulled that from. So this one came from a security policy. This pulled it from a section in the SOC 2 report. So it makes it really easy for you to independently validate in the report as well. You can copy paste this, look in the report, and validate these if you disagree and adjust with any of the answers. So this helps really streamline that security review. You can set your rating here, sets a default rating based on how in place or audited the controls are for the vendor. Leveraging the inherent risk, you can then determine, okay, based on these controls, the impact and the inherent risk of that vendor, what do I think this final risk rating should be? And can generate a full report to pass along to your team. So again, free access here. You get 2 free AI credits. Feel free to get that. I'll jump back over to the screen here so you can log in here, create an account. And if you run into issues, we're happy to provide training. Jump on a quick call. If you run out of credits and want to try a couple more, let me know. I can certainly get more credits added, so you can try that out. So we are right at 2 p.m. on my time, right at the top of the hour. I'll hang out if there are any more questions, but I did want to thank everyone for joining today. Appreciate, again, the interaction. It makes these a lot more fun. Please, any feedback you have on how we can make these better, more valuable, topics you'd like to see us include in the future, never hesitate to reach out. But we'll send over a recording this afternoon, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day.